Welcome to part 2 of exposing the tax-exempt foundations. Here's a clip from a 1980s radio show hosted by Dr. Stanley Monteith.
But it was the function of our investigation to find out to what extent, if any, are the funds of the large foundations aiding and abetting Marxist tendencies in the United States and weakening the love which every American should have for his way of life. And then he goes on to say, so we set out to find the answers. We wanted to explore the problems of foundations by examining their actions, not their statements for the public. We felt that they are involved in the concepts under which foundations operate and grew in the United States as certain inherent dangers for the public welfare. We were not blind to the undoubted merits of the contributions of the numerous tax-exempt foundations to worthwhile causes, but it was our intention to find out the factual basis for preserving their constructive function and at the same time for supplying guidance for future legislation and administrative action against the use of foundation power for political ends. The story of that adventure, of what we found, and of the harassment to which we were subjected is included in this book by René Wormser, Foundations, Their Power and Influence. Well, let me tell you what happened to the committee. First of all, tremendous pressure was brought to bear on individual members of Congress who were on the committee to force them to stop the investigation. Pressure was brought to bear on other members of Congress to cut off appropriations for this investigation. The committee was routinely attacked by the New York Times and the Washington Post-Tribune and by all the major conservative and liberal media in America. Amazingly, a congressman named Wayne Hayes was appointed, and Wayne Hayes came from Indiana, and his specific function on the committee was to disrupt its hearings. In fact, the story is told in the book, and everything I'm telling you can be found almost in this book entitled Foundations, Their Power and Influence, which I strongly recommend to you. But Congressman Wayne Hayes, during one 185-minute period, interrupted the hearings 235 times. Why? Because he wanted to disrupt the hearings. They did not want the hearings to take place. Basically, of course, as the committee proceeded with its investigation under the direction of Congressman B. Carroll Reese, under the direction of the Chief Counsel, René Wormser, and under the guidance of the Director of Research, a man named Norman Dodd, who you're going to hear from later in this tape, they began to uncover incredible things. And, of course, one of the first things was that the great foundations were being used to change America. They were being used to change us from a free society into a socialist society into a fascist society. They were being used to change America from a sovereign nation into simply one more state in a new world order, into a new world government. They talk on page 204 of the book about the investigations into what the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace had done. And basically, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace had been endowed specifically to bring about world peace. Now, how do you bring about world peace? Well, they decided they had a great idea. They'd bring about war.
Here's more of the Norman Dodd interview from 1980 with Dr. Stanley Monteith.
But as I thought about it, I realized that most of them were new in their position. And my guess was none of them had ever read the minutes themselves, which would be, of course, quite a task to cover 50 years of minutes. You know, reading.
Certainly.
Accepted this invitation and selected a member of my staff, a Miss Catherine Casey, who was a practicing Washington lawyer, but who was on my staff to see to it that I, in conduct of the work of the staff, did not break any official rules in Washington, and was also unsympathetic to the investigation. Her attitude was, what could possibly be wrong with foundations? They do so much good. Well, I went out of my way not to prejudice her, but I did say that, Catherine, when you get to New York, you'll find that you can't possibly cover 50 years of minutes in 2 weeks, so you'll have to do what we call spot reading. And I blocked out certain periods for her to concentrate on. And when she returned from Washington, her eyes were figuratively as big around as saucers, and she brought back to me the following on dictaphone belts. We're back in 1908, and the trustees meet, and they raise this question among themselves: Namely, is there any means beside war known to man more capable, assuming you wish to alter the life of an entire people?
Now, these are the trustees of the Carnegie Foundation.
Right. And they discussed this question in a very learned fashion for approximately a year and come up with the conclusion that war is the most effective means known to man, assuming you wish to alter the life of an entire people. So then they bring up a second question, namely, how do we involve the United States in a war? And I doubt if in 1909 there was any subject more removed from the minds of us as a people than our involvement in a war. There were shows going on in the Balkans, and most of the people of this country hardly knew where the Balkans were. And they conclude that they must control the diplomatic machinery of the United States. And that raises question number 3, namely, how do we secure that control? And the answer comes up, we must control the State Department. And from that time on, their activities were centered on securing control of the State Department. Now, as a means to that end, the endowment founded an instrumentality called the Council for Learned Societies. And that council was assigned the task of passing on every high official appointment to the State Department before the appointment was confirmed. At that point, this finding linked up with what we had already suspected, but nevertheless here was confirmation of it. Well, this happened, and pretty soon the country was in a war, which came to be known, of course, as World War I. And this group of trustees at one point congratulated themselves on the wisdom of their original decision because, as they put it, war has demonstrated a power to alter the life of the people of this country already. And then their interest centered on seeing to it that we as a people did not revert to our customs and our practices which prevailed prior to the outbreak of World War I. And they decided after the war was over that meant we had to control education in the United States. And so they realized that this was a very prodigious task. So they approached the Rockefeller Foundation and made the suggestion that the Rockefeller Foundation take on half the problem and they retain the other half. They divided it between those subjects which were domestic in their significance and those which were international. And they together, the Rockefeller Foundation and the Carnegie Endowment, decided that the crux of the matter lay in their ability to alter the teaching of American history in this country. So they approached then 3 of the most prominent historians with that suggestion, and they were turned down flat. So then they decided they'd have to build their own stable of historians. And so they then approached the Guggenheim Foundation, which specialized in awarding fellowships, and said, figuratively, when we find a likely young man who's headed to become a teacher of American history, and will you grant him, on our say-so, a fellowship? And the answer was, yes, we will. So they gradually assembled 20. And they took these 20 to England, London. And there they briefed them as to what was expected of them. And that became the nucleus of the American Historical Association, to which, ultimately, the endowment made a grant of $400,000 for a study to be made which would conclude what the future of this country was to be. And at the end of 1932, this study comes out in 7 volumes, the last volume of which was a summary of the other 6. And it ended on the note that the future of this country belongs to collectivism administered with characteristic American efficiency. And that became I'm using today's language, that became the guidelines for higher education in this country. And then coincidentally with that, then books began to appear, all of which were detrimental to our vision of our own patriots who had signed the Declaration of Independence, and they were downgrading these men. Witness the most recent book on Jefferson that had to do with his having enjoyed a colored mistress and things like that. But no reason to write that sort of thing.
Now, were many of these books that have come out through the years funded, financed, subsidized by the great foundations?
Through the medium of their support of certain publishing companies, yes.
Did the mass media in the 1950s adequately cover the findings of the Reese Committee?
Oh, no.
Was there any effort?
Most reaction through the media were aimed at criticism of me as a personality, and that and let it go at that.
Well, certainly when the book, The Foundations, Their Power and Their Influence, came out, this was basically a book that covered the background of the findings of the Reese Committee. Did this book get any coverage as far as book reviews? Was it widely circulated?
No.
Did the public have an opportunity to find out what the great foundations were really doing?
No, this book circularized, or became circularized through the medium of what we refer to as the conservatives in this country. So it was, in a sense, a corroboration of what motivates the conservatives in this country. And they all had this book, and that's all there was to it. And this discrepancy and these contrasts and these contradictions are the telltale part that those who have imposed these practices on us as a people are scared to death that it's going to be picked up and stressed and taught and so forth and so on. But it isn't.
And so Norman Dodd reveals in an interview from 1980 the fact that education is what shines the light of truth on sinister forces. Here at Radio Liberty, we strive to make educational materials available to you. Please write us with your request for a copy of the Radio Liberty Resource Brochure. It will be our pleasure
to stop the investigation. Pressure was brought to bear on other members of Congress to cut off appropriations for this investigation. The committee was routinely attacked by the New York Times and the Washington Post-Tribune and by all the major conservative and liberal media in America. Amazingly, a congressman named Wayne Hayes was appointed, and Wayne Hayes came from Indiana, and his specific function on the committee was to disrupt its hearings. In fact, it's told
Welcome to part 2 of exposing the tax-exempt foundations.
to function as at the same time for supplying guidance for future legislation and administrative action against the use of foundation power for political ends. The story of that adventure, of what we found, and of the harassment to which we were subjected is included in this book, Rene Wormser, Foundations, Their Power and Influence. Well, let me tell you what happened to the committee. First of all, tremendous pressure was brought to bear on individual members of Congress who were on the committee to force them.
Here's a clip from a 1980s radio show hosted by Dr. Stanley Monteith.
But it was the function of our investigation to find out to what extent, if any, are the funds of the large foundations aiding and abetting Marxist tendencies in the United States and weakening the love which every American should have for his way of life? And then he goes on to say, so we set out to find the answers. We wanted to explore the problems of foundations by examining their actions, not their statements for the public. We felt that they are involved in the concepts under which foundations operate and grew in the United States as certain inherent dangers for the public welfare. We were not blind to the undoubted merits of the contributions of the numerous tax-exempt foundations to worthwhile causes, but it was our intention to find out the factual basis for preserving their construction